Hey kids, are you ready? I'm ready to read to you today. And I am going to read you one of my favorite stories. I read this story when I was in about 4th grade. And you know what it's called? Miss Osborne the Mop. It's kind of a story about magic. And it was written by Wilson Gage, and it was illustrated by Paul Galdone. And guess what? My copy of Miss Osborne the Mop doesn't even have a cover anymore. It has mostly words. It doesn't have very many pictures in it. When I find a picture, I will show it to you. But until I find it, I'm just going to be reading the words. So if you want to get a paper to color on or write something, you can. I'm going to read you this story, and I'm just going to read you chapter 1, and we'll read chapter 2 tomorrow. All right, so you'll have to come back for the rest of it. There's lots of chapters. We're going to be reading for lots of days because it goes clear to chapter 11. So if you want to get something to draw on, or if you want to just snuggle up and listen, I'm going to read you about magic. All right. This is Miss Osborne the Mop, chapter 1. Dill Tracy crouched on top of a rock and watched the door to his house. It was a big, old, gaunt gray house, shabby and weathered, but he had spent every summer of his life in it, and it seemed like a very nice house to him. He was wearing shorts and sneakers and nothing else. The sun was very hot on the backs of his legs. He shifted his position a little, and a big blue-tailed lizard which had joined him on the rock skittered lightly away. Dill was 11 years old. His name was John Pickett Tracy, Jr., but he had been christened Dill Pickle by some of his cousins, who took a dim view of him and felt that this was a more appropriate name than John Pickett. This had all happened such ages ago, and he had been called Dill so long that now almost nobody remembered that he had any other name. Dill didn't mind. He didn't really mind anything much, for he was a busy, good-natured boy. But right now he minded something, and that was why he was watching the house. What he minded was his cousin, Jody Ransom, who was spending the summer with him. Jody was just awful. She spent all her time crying. Everything made her cry. He bet she was inside crying right now. If she came out of the house with a picnic basket, he would join her. There was hardly anything to cry about on a picnic, and besides, he was starving. But if she came out empty-handed, he'd slide down off that rock and sneak away without her. He had had all the tears he meant to put up with for a while. Inside the house, Jody was, in truth, about to cry. "Jody," said Mrs. Tracy, "wouldn't you like to pack a lunch and take it down by the creek and have a picnic with Dill?" "Yes'm," answered Jody glumly. "I guess I would." "Well, wouldn't you like to come out in the kitchen and help me make sandwiches?" suggested Mrs. Tracy. "We could use the ham left over from supper last night, and I'll hard-boil some eggs." Jody sighed. "All right, Aunt Margaret," she agreed sadly, and she followed Mrs. Tracy out into the kitchen. Well, Mrs. Tracy got out the ham and the mayonnaise and bread and put the eggs in a pan to boil. She glanced every now and then at her niece's gloomy face. "Spread mayonnaise on the bread and mustard if you want it, while I slice the ham," Mrs. Tracy directed. Jody sighed again and began to unscrew the lid from the mayonnaise jar. "One sandwich is enough for me," she said drearily. Jody was inclined to be plump and was always making desperate resolves not to eat more than the barest minimum. "All right," said Mrs. Tracy with a nod. "But how about cake? You know, Dill will want some of that chocolate cake." "A big piece for Dill and just a little piece for me," Jody said. She had seen the cake Aunt Margaret had made that morning, with nuts sprinkled thickly all over the swirling chocolate icing. It looked delicious and fattening. Mrs. Tracy began to put lettuce and ham on the slices of bread, and Jody wrapped each sandwich in wax paper. Between sandwiches, she stared out the window where rhododendrons pressed up against the panes and made the big kitchen and its scrubbed old table and counter look dark and gloomy in spite of the white electric stove gleaming in one corner. This whole house is gloomy, Jody thought. I used to love the way it seemed so sort of ramshackle and old-fashioned, but now it just seems dark and gloomy. And Aunt Margaret went into the pantry to get the cake. Jody sniffed deeply and put her tongue to catch a tear that rolled down her nose because she just couldn't hold it back. If things hadn't started out so well, Jody told herself, if it hadn't looked as if it would be such a perfect summer, it might not seem so awful right now. But a whole month at the seashore had sounded so blissful, especially since they were all going to be there. Mother and Daddy and Jody and her two older brothers, Steve and Roger. And then everything had begun to happen. The glasses had been first. Jody could never figure out why in the world Mother had taken her to the oculist. She didn't feel as if she was blinking and squinting. Dr. Green was a nice man, but she didn't like having all those lights shined in her eyes and reading all those very dull charts. Just a muscular weakness, Dr. Green had said finally. We'll soon straighten it out. And then he had said Jody must wear glasses all summer. All summer, squealed Jody. Why, that's a short time, answered Dr. Green in surprise. It'll be over in no time. That wasn't the point, of course. It was bad enough to have to wear glasses at all, but worse when you meant to spend your days running up and down the sand and in and out of the ocean. You'd always have to be worrying about breaking them or losing them or something. And then to make matters worse, even more unpleasant, Dr. Green had given her the frames. You won't be wearing glasses permanently, he explained. No need to buy frames. I'll just lend you these, and at the end of the summer, you can give them back. So now they perched on Jody's nose, round and black and heavy and horrible. They make me look like an owl, she complained, a fat owl. And then Daddy had gotten a chance to go to Europe on an assignment from a magazine. I can't turn it down, he exclaimed patiently to Jody. With both Roger and Steve in college next fall, we'll need the money. Jody's summer dwindled before her eyes because Roger found a job. He could get a job that paid more than the job he had planned to take at the beach. And Steve's old camp director wrote and begged Steve to come back one last time as junior counselor before he went off to college. And Steve went. Even then, Jody and Mother could have gone to the beach together and enjoyed the ocean and had fun. But what had happened? Grandmother got sick, and naturally, Mother had to go take care of her. Lamb, I know it's a disappointment to you, Mother said soothingly while Jody sobbed over this last bit of news. All of us have been disappointed. This isn't what any of us had planned on, and especially not poor Grandmother. And you're lucky to have such a nice place to spend your vacation. You'll have lots of good times with Aunt Margaret and Uncle John and Dill. Jody stared. Her mother must be out of her mind to think that anybody could have fun with horrible Dill. It was pretty unpleasant up in North Carolina mountains, but Dill? Ah! And it was turning out to be just as bad as she had expected. Or maybe worse. Even the books she had brought to read made her head ache because of the glasses. And who wanted to go on a picnic with nasty Dill when she might have been swimming at the beach with Roger and Steve? Aunt Margaret finished packing the basket and handed it to Jody. Poor love, she said, and patted her niece on the cheek. I do hope you have fun. Jody managed a frail smile. She was a little bit ashamed. She should really try to be more cheerful for Aunt Margaret's sake. After all, Aunt Margaret had troubles of her own. She was the mother of that ghastly Dill. It was a bright June day. The path that led to the creek twisted among the hemlocks and laurel bushes and great gray rocks. Jody took a big breath of the clear air, spicy with the smell of some warmed leaves and needles. "For Pete's sake, are you crying again?" asked Dill, jumping off the rock. Jody didn't answer. She bit her lip and hoped she didn't get so mad at Dill she really did cry. She walked on, keeping her eyes on the path and trying to think of something pleasant. "Let's don't go that way," Dill called. "Let's go around by the bluff." "It's longer by the bluff," objected Jody. "But there's something interesting I want to show you there," Dill explained. "Ah, come on, Jody." "Oh, all right," said Jody grudgingly. "But you'll have to carry the basket." Dill backed off with his hands behind him. "How can I show you the interesting thing with my hands full?" he cried. Jody glowered. Dill hastily thought better of it. "You carry it to the interesting thing," he proposed, "and I'll carry it from there to the creek. That's about halfway. Honest, Jody." Jody considered. She wouldn't mind seeing an interesting thing. "Do you promise?" she asked at last. One thing about Dill, he never went back on a promise. "Cross my heart," he said cheerfully. So they took the path around by the bluff. All right, here's a picture of them going. The day was warm in spite of the breeze that rustled in and out of the gnarled rhododendrons. Jody switched the basket from one arm to the other. "When are we going to get to this thing?" she asked grimly. Dill was jumping up on a rock. He always leaped around like a mountain goat. Jody couldn't understand why he wasn't continually in casts and splints. As his father often said, nobody missed better opportunities to break a leg than Dill. "It's just around the bend, I think," he answered, jumping down. He ran ahead and disappeared into the bushes, thrashing around for a minute, and finally yelled, "We must have passed it. I can't find it. Oh, no, here it is." Dragging the basket, Jody walked slowly to the spot. There on the ground was a horrible-looking black lump of something. "What is it?" she asked impatiently. "It's a dead rabbit," said Dill, poking it with a stick. Or anyway, it was the other day. "Ow, wailed Jody. "Dill, you're horrible. I came all this way because you said it was something interesting. Oh, you're mean." "Why?" asked Dill, surprised. "I think it's very interesting. Look, there's its skull." Jody let the basket fall and put her hands over her eyes, or rather over her glasses. "Oh, all right," said Dill in disgust. He dropped the stick and picked up the basket. "Come on." He ran on down the path. Jody stood a minute, trying hard not to cry. Then she followed slowly. She wished she hadn't let him carry the lunch. The way he was jumping around, it would be nothing but crumbs by the time they reached the creek. But it wasn't. It was in pretty good shape. Jody poured the tart, cold lemonade into 2 pink plastic cups and handed Dill his sandwich and hard-boiled eggs. Then she settled back against a tree and chewed her single sandwich slowly to make it last longer. A picnic was fun, especially here in the cool shade by the creek. The water poured smoothly over a ledge of rock and landed into the pool below in a lovely hollow gurgle. The hemlocks leaned over their own reflections across the stream. Big white heads of rhododendrons bobbed and nodded. "Look at that squirrel," said Dill, busily cracking the shell of a hard-boiled egg. "Looky the way he can run along the branches like that. Squirrels are neat. And can they ever jump? It must be fun to be a squirrel." Jody looked from where the squirrel peered down at them from its tree. It gave its tail a brisk whisk or two, like a feather duster, and then ran and leaped out into space, seizing the tip end of a thin branch that bent far down under its weight. Jody slipped her lemonade. It would be fun to live up in the leafy treetops, but she'd rather be a bird, come to think of it. Up here in the mountains, there didn't seem to be many birds. But there was a bird singing now, wasn't it? She strained to hear over the noise of the water and of Dill's talking on and on about squirrels. The song seemed to be coming from the rhododendron, a mysterious and lovely song swirling down and down, like the creek spilling over the rocks. If only Dill would be quiet. "Don't crack your eggs so loud," she cried. "I'm not cracking eggs," he said indignantly. "I'm eating cake. That's my teeth crunching on the nuts. I like nuts on a cake and in a candy bar and even in—" "Will you be quiet?" Jody whispered fiercely. The song had begun to die away. "I guess squirrels are lucky," went on Dill as though he hadn't heard. "Always jumping and eating nuts. That's about all they eat, you know. Nuts like hickory nuts, nuts." The song had stopped. Jody turned angrily on Dill. "Oh, you!" she cried helplessly. She gave him a furious look. "Oh, shut up and be a squirrel, will you? She broke off. The sound of the water swirled and faded all around her. The breeze bent the white of the rhododendron flowers back and forth among the leathery leaves. Jody stared. For Dill was gone, and there next to the ball of crunched waxed paper, which had held his slice of cake, sat a small gray squirrel. Chapter 2. I'll see you for Chapter 2 tomorrow. Bye.